Chapter 5. Sarah drew in a breath of relief when Tucker returned to Margot's house, not realizing until that moment how tense she'd been while waiting for him. As for Tucker, he too seemed on edge and a bit preoccupied, and she wondered whether he was having second thoughts about even temporarily hitching his fate to hers. Not that she blamed him for that. No man in his right mind would want to be saddled with her. "Every light in the house is on," he said mildly as he came in. She blinked and looked around, surprised to find it true. She had been restless, and she had wandered from room to room, her skin crawling with that now familiar creepy sense of being watched. Her subconscious had obviously felt at least a bit safer with lots of light. She had very carefully not thought about the voice in her head. "He was outside," she said. Tucker stood in the small entrance hall, ignoring her automatic gesture indicating they could go into the living room. He didn't have to ask who she was talking about. "When did you see him?" "Right after Margot left, across the street, moving between two houses. I didn't see him again after that, even though I looked. But he's still there, still watching, still waiting." "I didn't see him when I pulled up, but it's getting dark," Tucker frowned. She tried to think of something reassuring. Maybe he's just watching. Maybe he didn't have anything to do with the fire, or with the wardrobe falling. "I hope you're wrong about that." "Why?" "Bad enough to be looking back over our shoulders for a guy in a black leather jacket. If he isn't the only one watching you, if he isn't the only threat, then we have no idea what the other threat looks like." Sarah half-consciously wrapped her arms around herself in an attempt to ward off the chill. Tucker reached out and touched her shoulder lightly, but said only, "I'm gonna turn off some of these lights, okay?" She nodded and wandered into the living room to wait for him. The plan, agreed upon earlier in a hasty discussion in the restaurant after Margot had excused herself, was to return to the apartment over the shop tonight and to leave Richmond in the morning. Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about that. There was a small, almost distant part of her that was alarmed by the hurried decision and bewildered by her willingness to just up and leave everything she had known. Yet a larger part of her consciousness was convinced it was the right thing to do. Yes, walk away from your friends, your business, and the ashes of your home because you're afraid. Put your trust in a man you met yesterday because he says he thinks you can change fate, even though he doesn't believe you can see the future. As wrong as it sounded, it felt right. This was what she was supposed to do. This was her fate, a fate Tucker was somehow part of. She knew that too. And that was what frightened her the most, because she knew it meant she was already walking the path that led to her destiny, toward the death she had seen. "I already checked all the doors and windows," she told him when he joined her in the living room. "That is what you were doing, isn't it?" He didn't try to deny it. "All locked. Drapes are drawn." He paused, then added, "There were automatic timers on a couple of the upstairs lamps." "Yes, Margot always sets them when she goes out of town. The living room lamps have timers as well." Tucker didn't say why the subject interested him, but he seemed even more preoccupied after they locked up Margot's house and drove back to the apartment over the shop. "Why don't you go ahead and pack tonight?" he suggested, almost as soon as they arrived. "We might decide to leave pretty early." Sarah might have asked him why, but she was actually relieved to have something to do. It was very quiet in the apartment. Neither she nor Tucker seemed inclined toward conversation, and her nerves were very much on edge. Something was going to happen soon, and she didn't want to think about what it might be, so she packed. It didn't take long. Both she and Margot kept a few extra things in the apartment, including a packed overnight bag in case either had to go out of town for an unexpected estate auction or something like that. So it was a simple matter to take the bag from the closet and add in the rest of the clothing she had here. All the clothing she had left, as a matter of fact. All the anything she had left. That realization, late in coming but devastating, made her sit on the bed and cry. Gone. It was all gone. All her things. From the furniture she had lovingly collected over the years, to the strand of pearls that had been all she had left of her mother. The few family pictures she had, the pictures of David, the few gifts he'd given her, gone. And the work, all that hard work to restore the house, it was all gone. The hours spent covered in sawdust and plaster dust and paint spatters, wasted. The bruised knuckles and fingers sore from using unfamiliar tools, wasted. The shopping for just the right moldings, the right wallpaper, the right curtains and rugs and fixtures, wasted. Her life wasted. She didn't make a sound, unable even in that moment of intense grief to forget the man waiting for her in the next room. She didn't want him to hear her and come in here. Whether he offered comfort or bracing common sense, losing a house wasn't so much when compared to one's life after all. Those parentheses. She didn't think she'd be able to accept either, and she didn't want him to see her crumpled on the bed, red-eyed and weepy, because she just didn't want him to see her like that. It wasn't a very satisfying bout of tears and left her weary rather than relieved, but it did seem to take the edge off her nerves at least. And it seemed to leave her mind clearer than it had been in days. She sat there on the bed and stared at the packed bag and suddenly couldn't believe what she was doing. What was she doing? Running off to God knew where with a man she didn't know, abandoning her business and just bolting without a word to her partner and best friend, when what she ought to be doing was locking her doors and pulling up the drawbridge, guarding her own life as she had always done. She started to rise, bent on going out into the other room and telling Tucker she couldn't go with him, and that was when it happened. The room around her vanished. There was nothing but darkness, so black and impenetrable it was a solid mass around her. She couldn't feel her legs beneath her. She couldn't move. She couldn't hear anything. And all she knew was cold fear. Out of the black silence, gradually, the sound and sensation of air rushing past filled her senses. She was moving, she knew that, moving through space and time, moving into the future. She didn't want to go, struggled against it, but she was given no choice. She had to go, had to see. At first, the vivid images exploded out of the darkness with such bright intensity that she was blinded and couldn't see them, in a confusion of sounds so loud and garbled it hurt her ears. But slowly her eyes and ears, or her mind, adjusted until what she saw and heard began to make sense, or at least as much sense as a waking nightmare ever made. There was a low hum, the sound of many voices murmuring, like a carrier wave permeating everything. And then a male voice, one she suddenly remembered from that other waking nightmare, said calmly above the hum, "Even if you run, we'll find you. We'll always find you." She tried desperately to see his face, but all she could see was his silhouette, like a featureless shadow on a wall. Then he was gone. It was getting colder. The antique shop. It was late, very late and dark. 2 cars crept up to the curb, their lights out. Men got out of the cars in an eerie silence and moved toward the shop. She couldn't see who they were, but they carried things she knew were deadly. Not just guns, but other things that made her skin crawl. She wanted to scream out a warning, to alert the neighborhood and signal those inside the shop that danger approached. Then she realized that the men were going to the apartment above the shop, and she knew whom they were after. They're after you, Sarah. No. She didn't want to listen to this voice, the insistent one she'd heard in her head before. They'll get you. You have to leave. You have to run. But where? Where should I go? The background hum of many voices whispering grew louder, drowning out the voice the way electrical interference drowned out a radio signal, and Sarah wasn't even sure she heard north. Who are you? She asked desperately. What are you? This time there was no answer at all, just the now quieter whisper she couldn't quite make out. It was getting colder. Blackness swept over her abruptly and lasted what seemed to Sarah to be forever. And the background rustle of those wordless whispers became louder and louder until she wanted to clap her hands over her ears to shut out the awful noise that made her head ache. It was so cold, so cold. Sarah blinked dazedly and looked around her. She was sitting on the floor by the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her upraised knees, shivering. According to the clock on the nightstand, no more than a minute or two had elapsed. It felt like a lifetime. She sat there for several more minutes until the shivering gradually stopped as her body temperature began to return to normal. She didn't know why it always dropped when the waking nightmares came, but it always did, leaving her chilled for a long time afterward. Even her skin was cold to the touch, and she rubbed her hands together slowly to try to warm them. Her body obeyed when she tried to get up, but it was stiff and sore, as if she had endured some kind of physical trial. But for the first time, she came out of it with a sudden, bitter self-awareness. Waking nightmares. Bullshit. Why did she keep calling them that? Who was she trying to deceive? Herself. They were visions, and what was the use of calling them something else? A different definition didn't make them any less real, any less frightening. Visions. I have visions, and let's not forget the voices in my head, at least two different ones. Visions urging her, driving her through fear. One voice insisting she couldn't escape, even as another one insisted that she run. And over it all, permeating everything, was her numbing certainty that no matter what she did, no matter where she went, that yawning grave was waiting for her at journey's end. She left the packed bag on the bed and went out into the living room where Tucker was watching a news program. He immediately turned off the set and got up when she came in, his eyes narrowing as they searched her face intently. Probably look like I've seen a ghost, haha. Sarah, are you alright? Not really, no. Has something happened? He didn't want to ask her whether she'd had a vision, but it was obvious that was what he meant. Sarah realized she was still rubbing her hands together when he briefly looked at them, and she started to tell him it was because she was still so cold. But that would take too long to explain, so instead she said simply, "We should leave now." Why? Because they'll come tonight, come for me. How do you know that? Did you see it in one of your waking nightmares? He was good, she thought dimly. His voice hardly gave away his disbelief, hardly at all. I had a vision, she said starkly, just now. They will come tonight, Tucker, and if we're here... In an abrupt gesture he nodded. Then we'd better leave. But in the end, he had another idea. The security system guarding Mackenzie's house was a good one. It took Murphy almost 3 minutes to bypass the alarm and get inside. She didn't turn on any lights, depending on the narrow beam of her pencil flashlight to find her way around. She didn't waste any time moving from room to room in a quick, methodical search. Within 10 minutes, she was in his office and had the wall safe behind his desk open. She ignored some stock certificates, leafed uninterestedly through a couple of contracts with his publisher, and swore softly when the safe offered nothing else. She kept searching, paying close attention to what she found on the cluttered desk. A folded map held her interest the longest. She spent several minutes bent over the desk studying it, and when she straightened at last, she slipped it into the leather pouch at her side. "Not quite as smart as you think you are," she murmured. Her cell phone vibrated, and she pulled it out of the leather pouch with a scowl. "Yeah, what?" "Find anything?" His voice was, as always, almost preternaturally composed. "If I do," she responded with equal calm, "I'll report, as agreed." "We're running out of time, Murphy." "You don't have to tell me that." There was a brief silence, and then he said somewhat dryly, "You might at least reassure me that we have the same goal in mind." "I might." She smiled in the darkness of Tucker Mackenzie's office and did not add the requested assurances. He knew her too well to push, though the almost inaudible sound of a sigh reached her intently listening ears. His voice was carefully matter-of-fact when he said, "I need information, Murphy." "Yes, I know. Give me a chance to do my job." "Very well. I'll wait for your report." "Do that." She turned off the phone decisively without waiting for him to sign off first. She was willing to bet she was one of very few who would dare to hang up on him. She liked that. The cell was a burner intended to be used only once and then discarded. She'd toss it into the nearest dumpster before moving on. It was too easy to track cell phones these days. She'd have another burner in an hour, and he'd have to wait for her to call him next time. She liked that, too. She stood there in the dark and silent office for several more minutes, thoughtfully fingering the folded map in her leather pouch. Finally, she left the office and made her way from the house, pausing only long enough to lock up behind herself and put the security system back online. The neighborhood was dark and quiet in the hours past midnight, and Murphy went on her way without attracting any notice, not even disturbing the few sleeping watchdogs with her softly whistled rendition of stormy weather, in perfect pitch. "But why?" Sarah asked much later. We know somebody is watching you." Tucker's voice was patient. "What we don't know is whether the guy in the black jacket is all we have to worry about. I want to know that, Sarah. I think we need to know that before we leave." His car was parked near the shop as before, but in the dense shadows of a spreading oak tree. There was, he'd explained to Sarah, a clear path of retreat here, with little chance of the cars being hemmed in by other cars, assuming, of course, that no one realized they were sitting in the car. They had eaten and then returned to the apartment above the shop as if they intended to spend the night there. Then they had slipped out and made their way cautiously and hopefully unseen around behind several houses and back to the car. Timers on the lights inside the apartment made it look as if they had settled down for the night around 11:30. It was now after midnight. Sarah had realized only gradually that Tucker had had something like this in mind even before she'd had her vision. For one thing, he had left Margot's house with 2 of her automatic timers in his pocket. For another, he had brought from his own house a couple of thick blankets and comfortable pillows. Sarah was using the blankets and pillows now, reclining in the back seat and wrapped snugly against the chill of the night. Tucker was in the front, sipping hot coffee and watching. He'd had the foresight to remove the light bulbs from the car's interior lights so they wouldn't give away their return. But there was still, he told her dispassionately, at least a 50% chance that if the man in the black jacket was watching, he had seen them. In the dark quiet of the night, Sarah was wide awake and almost unbearably edgy. It was horrible, waiting to see whether someone would come as she had seen. Horrible waiting to find out whether she was meant to die tonight. Do they want to kill me? I don't know. All I know is that I'm afraid of them. Terribly afraid. I won't let anything happen to you, Sarah. His voice was low. After a moment, she said, "You're a touch psychic yourself." No, it doesn't require psychic abilities to know you're frightened. Anybody would be. But I am not going to let anything happen to you. I promise. Promises can get you in trouble. They have before. That one won't. Still edgy, she asked, "Why are you doing this, Tucker? Why are you getting involved in my problems?" We've already discussed that, remember? Because you want to keep me alive long enough to find out if I'm for real. When he answered, it was slowly. I know you're for real, Sarah. I know you're not a charlatan, not faking psychic ability for some reason of your own. I know that you genuinely believe you can see the future. You just don't believe I can, which is one reason why you're out here, right? So you can see if they come the way I saw them. She tried not to sound defensive. Again, he hesitated before responding. That's one reason, to see something that hasn't happened yet. Of all the psychic abilities, that's the one I find most difficult to believe. How can you see what doesn't yet exist? How can the human mind possibly do that? Sarah closed her eyes. Do you think it's any easier, any more believable to see a place you've never been, even though it exists? To see something that happened long ago in the past, when you weren't there? To have someone touch your hand and know something about them? Something so secret they don't even tell themselves? I don't know. I suppose not. He sounded a bit wary. Doesn't like the idea that I might know all his secrets. You don't believe in those things either. You always think there must be some logical explanation, some deception involved. I know you aren't trying to deceive anyone. Then I'm either crazy or I'm telling the truth. The truth is you believe it to be, which is just another way of saying I'm crazy. Thanks. I hear voices in my head. You'd really think I was crazy if I told you about them. No, that's not what I'm saying. Hell, I don't know what I'm saying. I can't blindly accept the party line, Sarah. I can't tell myself I could see a unicorn if I only believed they were real. It's not the way I'm wired. Quietly, she said, and yet I've never met anyone who wanted so desperately to believe. To that, he said nothing. Sarah lay there in silence for a while, her eyes closed. She heard his occasional faint movements, smelled the coffee he drank, and mentally looked at his face. It was a good face, but it puzzled her a great deal and made her feel more than a little apprehensive. What made a man like Tucker? He had achieved unusual success in his chosen field, penning bestseller after bestseller that enjoyed critical as well as commercial success. She had read several of his novels, though she hadn't mentioned that to him. They were clever, those stories, not only entertaining but intelligent and well-researched, peopled with vividly alive characters, and left the reader satisfied. He was one of those semi-famous authors who had not quite crossed the line into mainstream celebrity. His name was very well known, but his face was unlikely to be recognized on the street. At least 2 of his novels had been made into films, but Sarah had read that he wanted nothing to do with that interpretation of his work. He wrote books, other people made films, and so had taken no part in the process. So, He was wealthy enough that he probably wouldn't have to write another word for the rest of his life, if that was his choice. Successful enough to have reached the peak of a difficult and demanding profession while still in his 30s. He was single. Did he have family, friends he cared about? Behind her closed lids, another face appeared, clear as if it were a color photograph. And she studied it for several seconds. A pretty face. A face she didn't know and yet did. She knew the face, the woman. She knew her name, Lydia. She knew what Lydia was to Tucker. She knew what had happened to her. It was no vision, no dramatic sequence of images and sounds. It was simply a knowing, a certainty of fact she should not have known. It had happened to her before, since the mugging, but infrequently and only with people she had known well. Never before with a stranger until Tucker. Sarah opened her eyes as the face faded into darkness, and for a moment she was tempted to tell him what she had seen, what she knew. But she didn't. In the last few months she had learned too well the costly lesson that even the people who wanted to hear the truth all too often hated the truth-sayer for telling them. So he was going to have to ask her. When he was ready, when he stopped doubting her, then he would ask her. Only then would she tell him what he so desperately needed to know. Unable to bear the silence any longer, she said, "All this isn't interrupting your work, is it?" "No, I'd only just started a new book and it wasn't coming together very well. A break will do me good." "Just a little break to go on the run with the hunted psychic. You never know. Maybe I'll get a book out of it. And maybe you'll get dead." But she didn't say it, of course. Instead, she said, "Where will we go?" "I have a feeling that once we get moving, you'll know which way to go," he said, with more confidence than she thought he had any right to feel. "North. I think we have to go north, but I don't know how far, or why we have to." But all she said was, "And until I know that, assuming I do, away from Richmond is the first priority, I think. Unless you disagree, our first stop will be a place near Arlington." "Why Arlington?" "Heading north, and I didn't even have to tell him we're supposed to. Fate again." "Because a friend owns a cabin near there, a place to rest our weary heads and plan the next stage of the trip." "Plan?" "We'll come up with something, Sarah." "You just want an adventure, a road trip, that's it, isn't it?" He chuckled. "Yeah, that's it." She was silent for several minutes, then said abruptly, "I should have gone to the bank. I don't have any money." It had just occurred to her that this was likely to be an expensive trip. Tucker responded promptly, "I stopped by my bank this afternoon and got some cash. Enough, I think. We'll need to avoid plastic, avoid using ATMs because of the cameras, cell phones because they can be pinged, which is why I left mine at the shop and asked you not to bring yours, or anything else that might give them a way to track us as we move. Cash is the way to go." "I can't let you, Sarah. It's not a problem." "Yes, it is. I can't let you pay my way. Look, if it really bothers you, we'll settle up later. Until then, don't worry about it." She was silent, but not happy. It went against the grain for her to depend on anyone else, particularly financially. She hadn't even allowed David to bring in an occasional bag of groceries, and he practically lived at her place, something Margot had scolded her for. "He eats like a goat, Sarah. Why the hell shouldn't he kick in for some groceries? He's got you cooking for him practically every night." Sarah frowned, a little startled to realize that the memory had roused resentment rather than pain. He had usually suggested they eat at her house, and he hadn't been able to cook, so she always had. Sometimes he'd helped her clean up afterward, but many times he'd had to eat and run because of business calls he needed to make from his own apartment or something like that. Now that she thought about it, he had bought dinner once or twice a week when they ended up having sex. Jesus, he was paying for it. Sarah? Dinner out, sex. A little quid pro for his quo. Wonderful. Why didn't I see it before? Don't be so upset about the money. She wrenched her mind back to the present and drew a breath. Okay, but I expect you to keep track. This is my little adventure more than yours, and I'll be damned if I let you pay for it. Gotcha. As long as we understand that. We do. They fell silent again. Sarah shifted a bit. Mercedes or not, the back seat wasn't a terribly comfortable bed. Then again, she was probably too edgy to sleep. Like last night. If this kept up, she'd really be a bundle of raw nerve endings. What time is it? After 1. Felt like dawn at least to Sarah. She was so tired. Why don't you try to sleep, he suggested. If you watch all night, you'll be exhausted. I can lose a night or two without it bothering me too much. Probably comes from a habit of all-night writing marathons. Try to sleep, Sarah. She didn't think there was a chance in hell of her actually sleeping, but she once again closed eyes that kept drifting open. And this time she did her best to stop thinking. Following directions from a relaxation tape she'd listened to, she concentrated on letting all her muscles go limp and imagined lying peacefully on a beach, listening to soothing ocean waves. That was the last thing she remembered. Sarah? She came awake instantly, her scratchy eyes and heavy head telling her she hadn't slept more than an hour or two, if that. Look. She sat up carefully, fighting her hands free of the cover so she could rub her eyes. Took her a moment to focus and to look where Tucker was looking, but as soon as she did, she saw them. Oh God, she whispered. The 2 cars, lights extinguished, were coming down the street toward the shop from the opposite direction. In an eerie quiet that didn't even seem to contain the faint sounds of engines, the cars pulled into parking places at the shop. Doors opened, no interior lights betrayed them either, and men got out of the cars. Sarah numbly counted 8 men, 4 from each car. So many, she whispered. Tucker nodded, silently watching. The men slipped toward the building, some going around to the sides and back. They all seemed to be wearing black, or at least dark colors, and Sarah strained to see whether the tall watcher was among them. Do you see him? She asked Tucker, still whispering. No. Neither do. Oh, that can't be. But it is, Tucker responded grimly. One of the men had paused for a moment at the end of the walkway, and the light from a nearby street lamp shone full on his face. Then he was moving with 2 others toward the stairs that led to the apartment. I don't understand, Sarah said. Why would he be here? Why would he be doing this? I don't think we want to stick around and ask right now. Tucker released the emergency brake, and since the car was out of gear, and only the brake held it stationary on the slight incline where he had deliberately parked, it immediately began to roll forward silently. They were well down the street when Tucker finally started the engine. But even then, Sarah couldn't help looking back over her shoulder. Already the shop was lost to sight, and no screaming engines followed them as Tucker turned a corner and headed for the highway. But what Sarah had seen was branded in her mind. How could she trust anyone when even cops came sneaking in the middle of the night to kill her? Son of a bitch! Sergeant Lewis stood at the foot of the stairs and watched his breath miss with the curse. He was vaguely aware of one of the men coolly disabling the shop security system and going inside, but he didn't bother to follow. They wouldn't be there. They were long gone. And he was anxious to get out of here. If one of the neighbors happened to wake up and look out a window, he'd have to answer some very uncomfortable questions in the morning. His cell phone rang just then, and he swiftly drew it out of an inner pocket and answered before it could ring again. Yeah. Of course he knew who it would be. Who else would it be at 4 o'clock in the fucking morning? Well, we missed them. I know that. Lewis looked around at darkness and shadows and felt his heart thud a bit faster. You bastard, where are you? What I want to know, the cool voice continued, is how you intend to find them now that you've lost them. Lewis gritted his teeth and spoke between them. I'm sure you have a suggestion. I have several. You won't like any of them. So, what else is new? Meet me in 1 hour, the usual place. Lewis opened his mouth to object, but the line went dead. Slowly he closed the phone and returned it to his pocket. He had a hollow feeling about the coming meeting, a very hollow feeling.